to Resilience Radio. In this short episode, we'll be talking a little bit with Melanie Meyer, naturopathic doctor, about chronic inflammation following an acute infection, and enjoy the conversation. So in the main part of the interview, you were talking about one of your specialties right now, or one of your interests is the chronic conditions that happen post an acute infection. And of course, things that come to mind are Lyme and long COVID, and I'm sure there's shingles and other main ones in there. Can you speak to similarities between the different viruses and infections, as well as sort of what happens when something goes from being an infection to long term? What's physiologically happening in the body?
Well, there are quite a bit of variations on that depending on the disease. But the things that I see most commonly in clinical practice is, and one of the biggest sort of complaints post-infectious disease is this lingering sense of fatigue, like a low sense of vitality, and often like a brain fog. And so in those cases, we start to look for, if it's a virus, for example, a lot of these viruses do have quite a bit of neuroinflammatory activity that they seem to usher in for people. And when we think about how hard the body has to work to address these infectious diseases, oftentimes we're seeing that if somebody came in with, let's say, a suboptimal sort of resource base, like, for example, maybe they don't eat as well typically, or they have a kind of on the go lifestyle where they're not necessarily as well nourished as we might hope. There's resource depletion that is usually exacerbated because now the body has had to work that much harder and use so many resources in addressing the infection. So a lot of times the person's left feeling really depleted. And so we see a lot of chronic fatigue as a result of that. There's also, again, depending on the organism that's causing the problem, there are also quite a bit of inflammatory aftermath pieces. And in many cases with any chronic disease, an inflammation that is overzealous or that persists beyond that acute phase is really one of the sort of inciting things that is causing ongoing dysfunction for people. So, for example, inflammation is actually a gift. It's the body's response. It's a buffer. It's the body's attempt at sort of putting police line tape up to keep this part of the body isolated and allow for us to get resources, supplies, immune cells there to repair the damage or to address the problem. But then once we move past that acute stage, inflammation doesn't serve us as well. Inflammation was a great gift when we needed it for that acute assault, whatever that might be, whether that's infection or injury, anything that might be. But then after that point in which we've addressed that acute problem, if the inflammation is in such a cycle that it persists, that's where we see a lot of the aftermath. So people might have digestive aftermath after an infection. They might have, dysfunctional neurologic function. Like there's a lot of things that inflammation actually can really trigger and perpetuate for people. And that's what we're seeing a lot of. And one of the key things we see with post-infectious, sort of aftermath is the sense of, and it's very difficult to like put a classification on when you're trying to do, for example, insurance coding, like medical coding for this, but it's like this sense of brain fog, this sense of cognitive dysfunction where, people aren't quite bringing things together as effectively from a cognition standpoint as they once did. And that's something that feels very upsetting to people. So if we can start to figure out, like, how do we unwind the inflammatory process? How do we better support a more balanced inflammatory process in the body? How do we make sure that they're getting the resources and nutrients that they need at the cellular level? Because when you think about cell biology, our little energy powerhouse, we all learned it as the energy powerhouse, the mitochondria, right? The mighty mitochondria. When we think about mitochondrial function, that's how we're generating energy at the cellular level. And when we think about the thing that we know in like the hierarchy of science is the cells are, these smallest units, right? That cells make groups of cells make tissues, groups of tissues make organs, and then we have organ systems, et cetera. It's the hierarchy of biology. So if you're not feeding the cells, if you're not making sure that the mitochondria have the nutrients they need to generate energy, then you're always going to have dysfunctional health. So we were always taught in naturopathic school to really address what are we putting into the cells? How are we treating the cells? Because ultimately, all disease starts in the cell at the cellular level.
So when you have a chronic condition, and I know that each one is very different when you're talking about something like shingles, or or if you're talking about Epstein-Barr or long COVID.
Or Lyme or COVID,
yeah.
right?
What's the relationship between what's happened to sort of how these viruses or other infections are sort of still living in the body and interacting with the cells? What's going on?
Some of those, like for example, Epstein-Barr virus and like the herpes virus, or like any virus, like in those families, those often, they once, like for example, when we got the chicken pox back in the day, when we have the chicken pox, that virus stays in a sort of latent or dormant state after the acute episode, right? But things that would cause the immune system to sort of downregulate, like stress, for example, stress is the biggest deterrent to great immune function. Well, that's my opinion, but stress is a big barrier. So that's one of the things we always address when people are having like reactivated or sort of chronic viral presentations of these viruses that normally, like Epstein-Barr, most of us had it in our teens or 20s, and then we don't see it again. It stays latent. It's not presenting. But in some folks where there's some challenge into the Department of Defense, we see that those viruses have a window of opportunity to reactivate, and sometimes people will get symptoms. So you have to kind of have a basic knowledge of that particular organism that's causing the problem. And sometimes it's rather difficult to identify which organism is causing the problem, but naturopaths like to do some deep dives into that, and try to investigate a little bit. But if you're looking at like one of those types of viruses versus something like Borrelia burgdorferi, which causes Lyme disease, ideally, once we treat the Lyme disease with an antibiotic, for example, ideally the person moves past that and they don't see lingering symptoms. But occasionally there's the thought that, sometimes these organisms like that one, for example, are pretty good at hiding and sort of evading our immune defense. Our Department of Defense isn't quite up to the speed, right, that we want it to be. And so a lot of times they'll find that there are these lingering problems, especially related to inflammation, that seem to contribute to some of the health manifestations that we see after that infection. And fatigue is one of the big ones. And sometimes people will have ongoing joint pain and things like that. So, usually we look at inflammation. We try to build the Department of Defense and balance that function. And then, we always work on, making sure that we are adequately nourishing someone so that their cells can do this healing work that's necessary. Because most of the things that people come in with, especially in a naturopathic practice, are functional issues that where it's not necessarily somebody coming in all the time with an acute issue, but these functional lingering things where there's some barrier that's keeping someone from functioning at their best level, at their highest quality of health. There's always some barrier. And so as part of that relationship, we really try to get into the nitty-gritty and find out what's blocking somebody from really healing well. And it's a difficult task, but it's worthy, because once somebody removes a couple of key barriers, oftentimes their quality of life is exponentially better.
So you've been talking about inflammation in the chronic sense and how it might be inflammation's good in the initial infection, and then the
Absolutely.
lingering inflammation when you're not quite resolving the infection is maybe a nutritional imbalance. I'm synopsizing maybe an inaccurate way from what you're saying. But what I'm curious about is to sort of take a step back and look back at the initial inflammation. And do you think that, I know that we have a tendency to, when we see inflammation, be afraid of it, be it the swelling from a bee sting or the pain related to stubbing your toe, that we want to ice and we want to take meds to bring down the inflammation. Do you feel like that when people do that they're more likely to be getting the chronic conditions?
Not necessarily. There's no badge for excess suffering. The body will, there's certainly a place for palliation, but the body typically is pretty adept at generating the inflammation necessary to resolve that acute issue, and doing a little bit of a decrease makes somebody comfortable enough that they can bear it. So there's a place for ibuprofen, there's a place for ice. And then in the case of fever, though, that's one of the ones that, there's some controversy in many cases about, do we repress a fever? In some cases, it makes sense to repress a fever if it's going too high, because that can cause neurologic damage. And then in other times, if we have a lower grade fever state, if we can bear through it a little bit, it gives our body a little bit of an edge at addressing this infection, because a lot of these, are having a little bit higher temperature sort of speeds the response of our immune system. And a lot of these organisms don't do as well with excessively high temperatures. And it allows us to sort of address the problem naturally. So we don't always want to suppress our body's attempt at healing, but when it comes to chronic suffering or like immense suffering, I think there's a little bit of room for doing some soothing there.
So not having martyrdom of I don't take meds kind of thing, and I'm just going to let my body suffer through, but but also respecting the body's process that's going on.
Right. Not necessary to suffer needlessly, but certainly, our bodies are very good at trying to maintain, the whole, basis of health is homeostasis, right? The body tries to reach a steady state, and we always view symptoms as the body's attempt at remedying a problem, right? The body is trying to get to its steady state. And so we do try to honor that, like, and let symptoms play out sometimes. But again, sometimes we're a little dysregulated and there's unnecessary suffering at play, and then we have to intervene a little bit.
When I was thinking about the title for my business and this podcast being Resilience, was the original working title was actually, which is not a working title, is I was like, I want a name for my practice that's kind of like dynamic homeostasis, but isn't that, because that's a terrible name for a business.
Right. It's a good, like, nerdy band name. But yes.
But yeah, that's really what I mean, that idea of finding that balance point, and that it's a dynamic moving target, that there isn't a static homeostasis point.
No, things are always fluctuating, which is actually the fascinating thing about human biology.
That was Melanie Myers, and this is Resilience Radio. If you liked this episode, you can subscribe to it on the podcatcher of your choice, and if you have time, stopping to leave a 5-star review is always helpful.